March 16th, 2021. Ryan Ray alongside Chris Fenton. Mr. Fenton, how is it out in lovely California today?
That's good, man. We had some crazy winds blow through here the last couple of days. It might have been the remnants of the dust sandstorm that was blowing through Beijing a few days earlier. But lots of pillows being blown around our front lawn from our upper deck. So we're now in a nice state of calm. I think Beijing now has blue skies too. So anyway, we should get to it. Let's talk about everything that's popped up over the weekend.
Well, just as an aside, if you have not seen what Chris is talking about, I know Bill Bishop had some tweets. I think I retweeted it. I'm sure you retweeted it. I've seen it everywhere. Just Google Beijing sandstorm. It is insane what they had. So if you hadn't done that, before we get to the show, real quick, if you miss any of this, or if you just want to hear us more often, go down the podcast, Feeding the Dragon podcast. You can type that into iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever podcasts are found. I sent out a link from Shorby, which will let you pick it. It's really simple at my Twitter. Also, rating and reviews. I saw we got 4 5-star ratings, so we'd love to get some more. So please send those in. If you leave your name and stuff, we'll read it on the show. Okay. You know, I saw this over the weekend. I guess it was this weekend, and Bill Maher come out talking about China. And, Bill Maher is a guy that, depending on what he's talking about, I think he either really gets it or really misses it. He's for a self-proclaimed Democrat. He seems to be rational at times, at least from a libertarian perspective. And so I appreciate his commentary, but it really kind of brought the China conversation to a new audience with Bill Maher talking about it. I thought, what were your take on his comments?
Yeah, well, a couple of things on Bill Maher. Number one is I have admitted that I have been a Democrat my whole life. But as you know, I'm a nonpartisan patriot and somebody who believes in the populist sort of side of things, as long as it's not corrupted by either side of the aisle. Bill Maher, I've always thought, has been really interesting. He has the Rick Santorums on there and the Kellyanne Conways, and has shown both sides of the argument. Obviously, he is liberal. He's very Democrat, but I think he's also very tough on Democrats a lot of times. I never really understood why there was such a polarizing effect with him in regards to the right side of the aisle. And in fact, a lot of liberals actually have problems with him too. Maybe that's because he's trying to do the balance of some sort of nonpartisan take on some issues while also being very liberal on others. But the one thing I loved about it, and it was after we did our podcast the other day, is that he did spend the end of his show talking about China and talking about how the United States of America has been too preoccupied with lots of things that I know for a fact we are not going to agree on across the aisle. I really wish, in a way, and I hope I don't get lambasted for this in some way, but I wish there was a way where we could actually divide issues into 2 subsets. Like, one is something we can all agree on, whether it's justice, economic, and national security issues, things that can bond us together as common challenges, infrastructure, R&D, et cetera. And then there's the other subset, which are things that really divide red and blue, like guns, God, cultural issues, things that like we're never going to get together on, because China should fall in the first subset. And what I loved about Bill the other day is he almost said, hey, look, we got this subset of issues that we're never going to agree on, and it's occupying 95% of our brain space. And yet we have these other challenges that are facing our nation that China is kicking our ass on. And we need to stop all this bickering over here between red and blue and green and purple and everything else, and actually get our shit together to start talking about this challenge that is something we need to address immediately, because the clock is ticking. We are losing valuable time. And that is China. Now, I know people are pointed out, oh, his map in the background actually had Taiwan part of the PRC, and people were, getting on him about that. And there's all kinds of other issues and stuff. But to me, it was the macro. It was a Democrat. It was somebody with a left-leaning platform that is now on this case. And I noticed Senator Chris Murphy today of Connecticut is big on the China front also. And we know Chuck Schumer is too. And we actually know that Biden has Jake Sullivan and also has Anthony Blinken overseas in regards to being tough on China and talking to the Quad and talking to our other allies. So this is starting to happen. We're starting to bond over a common challenge. Let's keep it going.
Yeah, I would just simply submit that when we come to these issues, we need, if you want to separate them, as you say, foreign policy versus domestic, we have to be careful to understand that we're coming at it from different perspectives, right? So we might agree that China's a problem. We might agree that we want to fix it. But ultimately, that to fix these issues, you have to, our foreign policy is a reflective of our policy at home. And we've seen this with the war on terrorism. At first it was, hey, we're going to spy on the foreign terrorism. Next thing you know, it comes back home. And so I think when you look at these issues, the problem that we ultimately have is we can agree that China's an issue. It's hard to kind of separate these things out. So I think that is a viable solution. I would submit this, that can we come to a spot where we say, listen, we're going to work together on this one issue, but we're going to argue over all these other issues, and we know that we're going to do that. It seems that we can't do that. We can't say, okay, hey, we're just going to talk about this one issue and we're going to agree, but we're going to be critical everywhere else. And that seems to be the problem.
Yeah, I think you're right. But honestly, like if you think about what's instinctually human or an animal instinct, it's security, right? Like national security, feeling like you're defended from the elements, feeling like, any sort of threat, you have some sort of retaliation ability and defense mechanism. That's inherently human. So I know we can agree on that. I think financial security is something that breeds into feeling overall secure. And we have all kinds of financial issues ongoing with China. And then I think there are justice issues that as humans, you want to see some sort of fairness, some sort of blind justice occur. And that spills into the human rights issues and various other things that have created tilted playing fields in China's favor. So I would like to see if we can actually focus on some of that stuff, because quite frankly, if we do, we are capable of amazing feats as a country. We are very capable of amazing innovation and amazing accomplishments if we actually put our acumen and our energy towards it. What we haven't is we've been spraying our energy and spraying what we're capable of on all kinds of issues that I don't think are bonding us together as a unified front.
Well, let's get into one that will be, this is, in my opinion, when I'm critical of the U.S. policy on China, Trump was really beating the drum in 2015, 2016 about how China devalues its currency. So let's set aside whether you agree with the current spending bill and last year's spending bill. Just put that on the side. That is, in fact, devaluing the currency. Whether you agree with them or not on the purpose of the bill, it's just a fact. And you see right now, internationally, there is a push from all walks of life to go to Bitcoin. And how big the push is, how resilient it is, I don't know. At the same time, China is bringing out their digital yuan. And this is interesting because the U.S., what has given it its power for so long, is not its military per se, it's the reserve currency status. And that is being pushed by a bunch of different fronts. You have people who could care less about the U.S.-China issue. They just want to have Bitcoin because they don't like the fiat currency. How do we reconcile that issue, Chris, in this larger thing? Because the Bitcoin issue, the crypto issue, or just moving from the U.S. as a reserve currency to the digital yuan or anything else, that is something that Americans will have to understand how we're going to tackle. And by devaluing our currency, we're actually play into into the hands of Bitcoin or to China or to wherever you want to. So how should we tackle that issue?
Well, let's look at the macro. I mean, the fact of the matter is China would love to see the reserve currency not be the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar gives us, as you said, so much leverage, so much ability and freedom to do all kinds of crazy stuff with our central bank, the Federal Reserve, or to spend endless amounts of money that we print, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we really dictate what currency values are around the world simply because the dollar is the reserve currency. If China could get that to not be the case, and I'm not saying the RMB or the yuan becomes the substitute, but I do think they are very, very much rooting or creating Schadenfreude around the world for us to lose that reserve currency status. So I look at Bitcoin, for instance, where all kinds of Bitcoin is being mined inside the borders of China. In fact, they have all kinds of issues because of it. But if you also look at China, China also wants to not decentralize the way things are paid and the way products and services are valued inside their country, because they lose the tracking, the ability, the influence ability of the central planned economy and the centrally planned government. So Bitcoin to them, I think, might be sort of the enemy of an enemy is your friend kind of situation, where Bitcoin is moving people around the world off of the reserve currency US dollar. And that plays into the leverage and the strength of what China ultimately is trying to achieve. On top of it, they are creating their own digital currency. They are trying to create their currency into something that is more favorable than the US dollar. I don't know if it will ever get there. I think lots of people say that's a fool's errand. I'd argue, I mean, it's hard to tell considering how much we abuse the US dollar here in the United States of America. So I did send out a tweet about this $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. I actually remember when $750 billion was unpalatable in 2008. Suddenly 1.9 trillion seems okay, and then another 2 or 4 trillion in extra, infrastructure spending is coming down the pike. I just think China's licking its chops. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong for us to be doing infrastructure spending. In fact, I think we need to, but how we're paying for it or how we're not paying for it does play right into the China's sort of strategy overall.
Yeah, and just to hone in on the currency point, if you look at Iran right now, so the U.S. Trump administration got out of the nuclear deal with Iran. They put in sanctions. China went backdoor and said, we're going to deal with Iran. Now, China seems right now to respond to when the U.S. really wants them to do something like with Iran, if they really want them to, they would probably stop. The U.S. hadn't applied that pressure, so they're doing they're basically keeping Iran alive. Okay, that's overstatement, but more or less what's happening. Iran, the reason Iran hasn't gone to Bitcoin is because Iran, all the things that you said, they want to be able to track their people. And if they go to Bitcoin, they don't. But what's happened is you have Iran doing a deal with China. They're avoiding the sanctions and all the stuff that goes along with the reserve currency. So at some point, China will eventually say, hey, why don't you just come to our digital yuan? Or we'll roll out Huawei for a discount. And now all of a sudden, Iran, who wants to keep track of all their people, the digital yuan does that, Huawei does that. And that's so our foreign policy, you talk about with Greenleaf things, our foreign policy is a mess and it's terrible. And a lot of it is because the world's not the same anymore. And so we have to stop acting like this is 1980, 1950, 1940. We have to wake up. We're in 2021 now, and the market is out there. And so I think that we have to be careful, or we're going to wake up in one day. And listen, I'm not against Bitcoin, to be quite clear with you. We'll wake up in a world where Iran is doing a deal with China on the digital yuan, and whatever influence we thought we had is gone because it no longer matters. And oh, by the way, half of Africa is too. It's like, well, wait, and it didn't happen like that. And it doesn't happen like that, but it happens slowly. And then you wake up one day, and then boom, you're there. So that would be the concern from the U.S. foreign policy standpoint.
Yeah, I think that's right on the money, and it all falls into national security issues. I mean, let's face it, the United States dollar as the reserve currency is a massive national security issue. If it loses that status, there's all kinds of ramifications that will make us much less secure as a country. And it plays right into anything that the Pentagon should be paying attention to. Because quite frankly, when economic malaise or economic depressions occur, that creates all kinds of unrest globally, as we know. I've been sort of paying attention a lot to Matt Pottinger now that he's out of his role as the deputy national security advisor for Donald Trump, and is now doing all kinds of different speeches and working with the Hoover Institute and stuff. And I was listening to one of his panels that he did with Liz Economy, who I've also talked about a lot. And I thought one of the metaphors he used, I would say, I'll tweet it out. It was roughly 15 minutes into the program. He talked about this idea that we should look at the U.S. and China as a marathon race. And it's going to go on for a long, long time. And quite frankly, there's really only two members of the race that are way out in front of the pack. And at some point down the road, the marathon will end and there will be a winner. And the question is, do we want to be the winner or not? And one of the things he said is that he would sort of metaphorically speak that we haven't actually started the marathon yet. We're actually in a 400-yard sprint. And in order to qualify for the marathon, we have to finish in the top two spots of the 400-meter sprint. And he said, the next 4 years are going to dictate whether we position ourselves to win the marathon or whether we position ourselves to never have a chance to win it. And I thought that was really interesting because it was a serious ticking clock that he, through lots of really interesting experience, whether he actually lived on the ground in China, worked as a journalist, served abroad in 3 tours of military, did all kinds of stuff in regards to the Pentagon and our national security issues. I thought it was a really interesting point of view, and finally a really strong ticking clock that wasn't alarmist in a Donald Trump sense. It was actually very practical and applied. And I thought it made me go, oh my God, now we're really getting serious and we got to get this issue addressed ASAP. And the only way we can do it is have everybody thinking about it in the United States of America, because we need to apply pressure to get this done.
Yeah, and the only comment I'll say that I'm working on finishing Michael Pillsbury book, The 100-Year Marathon, Speaking of Marathon. I will be writing a review about it. And I haven't heard these comments. I'm responding to your comments about his comments. I would just simply submit to the listeners, as we talk about China, one of the things that I find frustrating when you listen to John Bolton or this other Pillsbury, if I just take their words at face value, what I've come to learn is that oftentimes what they thought they were doing back then was the right thing. And it turns out it was the wrong thing. And so Pillsbury tells us all the story over story over story about how they did this with China and they did this with China and China tricked them here. I have no idea if it's true or not. I wasn't in those rooms. What I do know is if I take it as word, we have to realize, you talk about solving the China problem, is that all this trying to play these foreign policy trick games, that just does not work. And we have post-World War II up until today that should teach us that. So when we think about the China problem, the stuff we talk about on this podcast, okay, well, we have these multinational corporations that are in China. And guess what? They actually have a lot of leverage. And if they wanted to make change in China, they're not going to get to be a liberal democracy. That's not going to happen. But they could probably get a lot more done than they want to. And so we talk about it. For me, it's kind of looking at what we've done and realizing that the policymakers have been, by their own admission, fooled, deceived, wrong about China for so long. And then the same thing about Russia. Same thing about a lot of stuff is that I want to be a little bit careful saying, hey, let's roll out new policies, because that's just got us to where we're at. And that's what sucks about it. So I'll let you respond. If not, we'll go on to the next thing, which is the Signal app.
Yeah, well, there's two things I'd add to that. One is you talked about how Pillsbury noticed, oh, we thought we were doing the right thing, and then it turned out to be the wrong thing. I think that's literally universally the storyline of anybody engaged with China. And I talk about it all the time. I don't think any of us were out there trying to sell the soul of America to make a buck. Now, we are all capitalists and we saw opportunity to make money, but we also believed in the idea that the more products and services from America we got into China, the more they would absorb this aspirational quality of democracy and become more like us. We also thought that the more we sold over there, the more GDP growth we'd have here and the more jobs and all that kind of stuff. And it turned out a lot of that didn't play out the way we thought. And a lot of us, including myself, we had an aha moment where it was like, oh my God, I've been smoking cigarettes every day for years because I was told it was good for you. And then one day somebody told me, no, that will kill you, and it's those aha moments that have awoken so many different people at so many different parts of this 40-year process with China. And we just need to make sure everybody's awakened now. So that's number one. So I got to take a look at Pillsbury's book, because I do like some of his speeches and some of the stuff I've read about him and from him recently. The other thing that I think is really interesting is Pottinger said in the panel the other day, that when China realized it was losing its influence directly over policymakers, lawmakers in Washington, D.C., when they started to realize that there was becoming a come together of both red and blue on the threat or the potential threat that China was, they immediately turned course and spent all of their time and energy trying to win over leaders of the business community and make the business community not only understand and remind them how big that market was and how big it was to become, but also remind them of the repercussions of going against certain ideas and principles and sensitive subjects to the CCP that has happened over time, and reminding them of the punishments thereof. That has been a really, really strong, tactful move by the CCP, and one that has really muddied the water in Washington, D.C., because every time somebody comes out in a position of changing policy or laws towards China, they get literally bombarded with lobbyists from every industry possible, trying to get them to water down whatever that hardline tactic was.
Yeah. So, the final thing is just a comment. I don't know. So the strategy, Pillsbury, I think, would agree with you about how we were trying to to liberalize China. And on some level, that's, I agree with, I still believe that. And so I think that the problem is, if you read Pillsbury's comments, like, the U.S. government plays the enemy of my enemy as my friend. That's our foreign policy. And you can just look at all the things we've done since World War II and further back. That's our foreign policy. And so a lot of the steps we took with China was, well, Russia's the enemy, China could be our friend, the enemy of my enemy. And so you look at how we've handled that. That just doesn't work. And so I think when you talk about the problems that we've seen today, is that the government has incentivized companies to work with the Chinese. And so it's like, well, hold on, this is not the free market working itself out. This is the government pushing people in a certain direction, and then we're mad with the results, and now we're gonna have the government come fix the problem that they created. So that repeating of the process. But anyways, the Signal app is banned, I believe, now from China. No surprise here. Which, well, I've heard some people speculate that maybe Signal isn't as safe as we thought it was, but with China banning it, maybe it gives me a little bit more hope that the messages are encrypted, actually.
Yeah, I'm sort of torn on the whole thing. Number one is the banning of apps, the great firewall that China has to essentially protect the CCP from their populace getting wrong messaging or narratives that don't work in their favor, is something that's completely wrong and against freedom of speech rights that I hold dearly, and something that irritates me every time I see it. But at the same time, I do remember after January 6th, when Parler was taken down, there were a lot of conversations about going after Signal and Telegram and other apps, where a lot of people were essentially regrouping their dissent, their voices of dissent onto those platforms from Parler, and how it was creating an issue for investigators and the FBI and all that kind of stuff. And it seemed like we were starting to creep towards banning those apps too at one time. And I just hope that we avoid that. It just doesn't feel right as an American to have this whack-a-mole of, oh, there's some bad actors on these different platforms, like, let's shut them down because these other platforms, which we know there's bad actors on also, seem to have enough good actors that that balances it, or whatever that is.
Well, and the Signal issue and the Parler issue goes back to my comments about Bill Maher earlier on. I don't know what he said about those issues particularly, but when you deal with China, you say, hey, we want China to be an open society. We want there to have free voices. It's like, well, oh, by the way, from China's perspective, what's said on Signal, we look at it as very benign. They look at that as Parler to us. And so it's relative, right? It's relative. So because they're, what they would allow to be tolerable speech, we would think is, oh my gosh, like that, like really? Like that's outside the lines. Okay, well, that's the same argument with Parler. So you can't, if you want to say, well, we want to knock Parler off because the speech is dangerous, that's the same logic that they're using. And so this is where I think the China issue becomes hard to unite people around, because we have to say we're okay with free speech. And you can get to the business aspect of it, put that aside for a second. But if we're okay with free speech, then we have to be, we call China out and say, hey, China, this isn't cool. And when they can't come back to us and say, well, you're banning apps left and right too, because then we're no different than they are.
Yeah, I don't. Honestly, free speech should be something that bonds this country together. I mean, we protect hateful speech, we protect loving speech, we protect all kinds of speech. There's ramifications for free speech, right? Like you can lose customers or whatever it is. But free speech is something that's so inherently American. It's crazy to me that we don't bond over this issue, and the fact that it muddies how we look at what China's doing, or in fact makes us feel or look almost similar to them in certain ways, which, by the way, I've brought that up in various conversations with some of my friends on the west side of LA, who, by the way, are both in, we're all in, I guess, the Democratic Party, but to compare China's crackdown on free speech rights and the firewall and all that stuff to what we did with Parler or what we wanted to do with Signal or whatever is just completely not a topic that's even allowed. Once again, that's a free speech crush right there too. So I just don't know why we can't talk about this stuff and why we can't agree on freedom of speech rights for people we agree with or disagree with. Like, I get the fact you can't run into a movie theater and yell fire, but there are lots of nuances that are way below that type of gravitas that should be allowed, that it seems like we're silencing.
Yeah, and I'm trying to pull it up here. I will in a second. A book I'm reading right now. It's actually going through some of the free speech arguments, and it's quite good. And if I can get my Kindle to load here in a second, I will. But one of the things that has been getting attention continually since we've led the charge, like everything else in this country, is the Olympics talk. And it feels like I think there was someone from the Miracle on Ice team come out and said, "Hey, we shouldn't go to Beijing." We've I wonder, Chris, we have what the Japanese Olympics are, 2 months out, something like that, 3 months out. They're close. So on some level, they're kind of getting overshadowed by the Beijing Olympics, the China Olympics next year. But once the Olympics die down, will this conversation die down, or will it heat up, or how do you think about this? Because it feels like it kind of ebbs and flows. Olympics is really hot one day, and the next day it's out. So how you reading what's going on right now?
Yeah, I have a hard time understanding exactly. Like, I mean, I saw Ted Cruz out the other day talking again about how we shouldn't penalize athletes for China, and it's just strange to me to hear him take that sort of strategy or initiative in his messaging when he's been such a tough critic on China. I almost feel like maybe he's friends with parents of an athlete and they're asking him like if they can help placate the issue or something. Like there must be something that has some conflict that's creating that. Because here's the problem is I think this whole idea of should we boycott or should we not is actually, once again, almost like the symptom of the cold. I mean, the cold we should look at, which is, do we have a pressure point? Do we have an ability to actually create leverage over China and actually enact some change in the short term on things because they really want something to actually happen that is in jeopardy? Like, to me, that's the question. And then how we use the threat of not going to get certain things would be something that I think we should be looking at. It's almost like, oh, we're just assuming nothing's going to change, so we're just not going to go. Yeah. Versus, wait, what if we say, hey, we're not going to go unless you do X, Y, and Z? Now, they got to be relatively doable in a short amount of time. We got to stay practical on it. But why don't we take that tactic? Like, that's called leverage in a negotiation versus this idea of, oh, we're just not going to show up because they're being jerks and we don't like what they're doing. Like, let's make something constructive happen with this leverage piece, because who knows how many times we'll have something like this.
Yeah, I agree that you need to. Yeah, I think, as we said on the show a lot, at least I've said, talking about it is what China doesn't want you to do. So just start talking about it. Hey, we want to, the Uyghurs. The Ted Cruz thing is interesting. I'm not sure, as hard as he's been on the NBA to take this stance on the Olympics, I haven't heard his full rationale. So maybe he can explain what seems to be contradictory opinions, but it is interesting. So the book I was talking about is Free Speech and Why It Matters by Andrew Dole. So folks who want to explore that, there you go. One other thing for me, Chris, I saw this is China warns European haters over human rights sanctions. I was beating this drum, I don't know, June last year, I think, when Germany was looking to be the president of the EU for 6 months. Xi Jinping had reached out to Germany, to Merkel like 3 or 4 times, to Trump once. China's really dependent on what they can do with whether or not they get the EU to go along. So if the EU ultimately decides to back whatever Biden wants to do, China is going to be, I don't want to say in trouble, like they're going to fall apart, but they're going to have, held, they're going to be a tough spot. If they can persuade the EU to go soft on them, I think they have an easy path ahead. Will the EU ever grow a backbone and stand up to China?
Well, not to bring it back to Pottinger again, but he actually brought this up when somebody asked the question about the EU and how we deal with the fact that they seem to be placating the CCP more often than not. And in fact, they even pushed through just before Trump left, at least the beginnings of a longer term trade negotiation. His counterpoint was like, look, if we want to be world leaders, we need to lead. And there's certain, allies of ours, like for instance, the EU, that hasn't been a leader in a long time. And we need to pressure them through our actions to follow suit. So there's no reason why we always got to get everybody to do it together with us at one time. It's like herding cats. Like, say, here's what we stand for. Here's what we believe our allies stand for. We are leaders of the free world. We're going to lead by example and enact this move, this initiative. And we are hoping that our allies join us in this cause, right? And Matt was like, look, typically the EU is 12 months behind moves that are big done by the US, but they do tend to follow suit. He's like, here's another example where we need to lead by taking action and people will follow. We don't want to cast them away. President Trump sort of said, hey, we're all in this, by ourselves and you do that. And we need to essentially say, hey, we get it. We're asking you to do something really difficult, but us as a leader of the free world, we're going to actually do it. And we're going to take that sacrifice and we hope you follow.
Agreed. I think that the EU needs to make its stance a little bit more clear, though, is do they want U.S. support as far as NATO goes and other things like that? Or do they want to be kind of this independent group? And that's one thing that Trump was good at pointing out. Despite some of the rhetoric, he was right to point out that they're scared of the Russians, yet they want Nord Stream 2 built. And so it's like, well, you're now more dependent upon the Russians. And so the EU has to figure out exactly how, what role do they want from the U.S.? And I don't think they really have a good picture of that. And so that kind of gets this mixed messaging, at least from our side of the ocean.
Yeah, I agree. And it would be, look, we got to look in the mirror before we start telling Germany, you're not doing the right thing or whatever, because we've been doing the wrong thing also. But I think at this point, it's really actions speak louder than words. Are we going to get serious about addressing China? Are we going to get serious about taking some sacrifice here in this country in order to address China? Like, think about it. We got to move back some really important national security supply chains. We probably need to move back some smart manufacturing parts of our manufacturing complex. We need to actually address trade imbalances, which are going to take very disruptive negotiations and redesignations by the WTO and by the SEC. We need to crack down a bit on this very loose policy of Wall Street when it comes to investing pension funds and various other passive investors into Chinese entities that have all kinds of nefarious influences, whether it's from the CCP or the PLA or the PAP. We need to be smart about this. It's going to take some sacrifice, and we need to lead by taking actions rather than talking the talk. We need to walk the walk, and the time is now. We are running out of time. It is a ticking clock, and I think I am going to run out of energy over 4 years if it takes that long to get people to wake up to it. And I'm just thankful that people like Bill Maher and Jake Tapper and Chris Murphy and others on the left are starting to catch on to what some on the right have been saying, because this is an all-country, all-hands-on-deck issue.
Okay, just a few minutes left. Anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I will say I posted a fun interview I did with Frank Morano on 77 KABC in New York City the other night. I thought it was one of my tightest interviews, and we covered a lot of space. So feel free to take a listen to that. I will post the Pottinger Liz Economy panel on my Twitter today. I think for those of you that read Mandarin or don't mind translated Mandarin, there was a great Voice of America Chinese article that I did an interview with that we covered a lot of new ground on. And I'm just out there being that squeaky wheel, and I appreciate everybody listening and supporting the podcast and everything else we do. And thanks for the interaction on social media.
Okay, with that, again, a reminder, you can download the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast at. And if you could, a 5-star review would go a long ways. It makes us happy. It is the unifying message of the day, as we say. If we can get around one thing, it is a 5-star review. What is today? Today is Tuesday. I'm sure maybe Mr. Fenton will get at least one more in before the end of the week. Until then, everybody stay safe out there.
Thanks, everyone.